The SciComm Collective acknowledges the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands we study, write and record on, and their sovereignty was never ceded. Hello and welcome to the SciComm Collective.
Different useful knowledge in different areas.
The joy is sharing it, making science accessible, the ignored final step of the scientific method.
Every different perspective.
Science is culture.
The SciComm Collective brings science and science communication to you.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the SciComm Collective. My name is Kate. I'm a current Master of Science Communication student here at UWA, and I'm joined by an old friend of the podcast, Dr Heather Bray. Heather has already recorded an episode with us. Go check out episode 2 if you so wish. And today, Heather, hello.
Hello.
So welcome to the SciComm Collective again, Heather.
Oh, it's lovely to be back.
So what are we talking about today, Heather?
So I recently gave one of these public talks, a science in the pub kind of talk, and you attended, which was lovely to have my moral support.
Someone had to be a heckler.
There in the background, but I made a reference that it was quite scary in some ways to be doing a presentation that wasn't me teaching, that was me trying to be a science communicator, trying to be the thing that I'm teaching you all to be. And I did reflect at the time, both in preparation and also there on the night, that it would be quite funny that if you guys were grading me. And as you know, when I ask you to do a presentation or any of these things, I ask you to give me a writer's statement where you tell me what it was that you were trying to do and whether you thought you were effective. And that's what I'm trying to try and do here today.
I mean, practice what you preach, really, right?
Exactly. And I think the take-home message from our podcast today will be, do what I say, not what I do.
There we go. So in a writer's statement, we have to do a purpose, audience, message breakdown. Can you talk a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so science presentations is one of the units or courses or subjects, no matter, depending on where you're from, that we study here, that it's part of the minor, and it's one of the core skills of a science communicator, being able to present your ideas using your spoken word, but also really your whole body when you're communicating. And so the writer's statement is a way for me to ask students to reflect on what it is that they were attempting to do, what was your intent. So who is your audience? Who are you speaking to? And what research do you have on them that helps you make those decisions? What are you trying to do? What's your purpose? Are you trying to educate, raise awareness, persuade? And what is your core message? And then how does that then influence all of the design decisions that come after? How did you structure your talk? What visual aids do you have? How do you present it to your audience? And then, it gives me something as an assessor to grade against, because it's not necessarily what I think you should be doing, it's how effective were you at what you were trying to do.
Which ties into reflexivity and all these things that you teach us in the courses.
Yes.
On that, I'm also now an alumni of the SCOM 2205 science presentations, which I took in 2024. One of the papers we talked about was getting students to watch their own performance back, which ties into reflexivity and assessing your own performance.
So with that, definitely being able to watch yourself and appraise your own learning. So a big part of becoming a successful presenter, I think, is not to be a natural extrovert, but to be considered in what you're trying to do, and then be able to reflect on your own performance and go, did I do what I achieved? And so, I gave you a piece of research in science presentations that said most people, usually after they give a presentation, think, oh God, I wasn't very good, and oh, that was terrible. But the research was suggesting in the paper that I gave you, and we'll make sure that this is in the podcast notes.
This will be in the show notes.
Yes, is that students often, when they praise them, find that they did a lot better. And so again, it's about learning to see presenting as a craft, not some sort of inherent skill that people are born with. This is something that can be taught. It is something that can be learned. It is something you can get better at. And I'm hoping that by us having this discussion today and really sort of deconstructing what I did and what I've already identified as areas that I can improve on, I'm hoping that I can sort of model that reflexivity and that learning
Absolutely.
for other SciComm students. You know, I'm someone who's been doing this for a very long time. I get paid to do it. Although it was really beautiful, my boyfriend listened to this podcast and he said I was quite good. And that's fantastic.
Yes.
It's like, yes, that it is actually my job.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's this kind of thing, like we get so in our own heads about what is it we're trying to do. I'm just hoping that I can show that this is still something that's a work in progress for me. I've given myself 2 or 3 things from this experience that I want to work on, and hopefully by showing by drawing back the curtain and showing that there's no magic here, there's just some hard work, that I can help everyone improve their presentations.
Fantastic. Well, let's get into it.
Yes.
Number 1, audience.
Audience always comes first. The first rule of SciComm. Who's your audience? So raising the bar is an interesting format. I group it with that family of sort of science in the pub experiences. So I've done Pint of Science, which is another one. I've done Pint of Science twice, once in Adelaide, once here. And I've also done Science in the Pub a couple of times in Adelaide. And this is the first time I've done Raising the Bar. But it's this similar kind of format where you have a inner city bar or pub. It's definitely not the sports bar kind of front bar.
More on the hipster side of things, trying to be cool, trying to be edgy.
Yeah, very much that kind of like thinkers and stuff like that.
Intellectuals.
Yes. So it's very much in that sort of genre. As we know, there's not a lot of evaluations of these kind of events. And so this already put me in a really interesting situation because I was thinking about the audience and these kind of events and thinking, okay, who is my audience? And I went to the organisers and said, so do you have any evaluations of these kinds of events and who are the audiences? And the response was sort of divided into 4 broad categories that included university students, alumni, industry, and I think community. And it's like, but I wanted a kind of a little bit more nuanced shades of grey on the community side of things.
And on that, I remember when I signed up for the event, there was a tick box that you had to assign yourself to, and it said, please tick all that are relevant. I ended up ticking every single one of them because I'm a UWA staff member, I'm a current UWA student, I'm a UWA alumni, and I'm technically a community member. And that was just, in a nutshell, all the talks and conversations around who was your audience. And there is no such thing as the general public because you belong to more than one public.
Absolutely. It's classic, isn't it? So you fit into multiple buckets, and I recognised multiple buckets within the audience actually on the night. But my guess was that given that this is an inner city bar, it was 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, I figured that I would be getting mostly highly educated professionals. So that meant that some of the concepts was going to speak about, I was pretty sure that I'd be able to speak about them with a sort of level of assumed knowledge. But I actually had sort of guessed that it would be sort of young, highly educated professionals. When we did have an orientation meeting just before the event, they actually said no, they tended to be older. And I definitely saw that on the evening. So we've got to remember, even though it was a free event, they've got to get into the city, potentially park if they don't work in the city. I mean, it was near a big public transport hub, but this is people that are not rushing home to feed children usually. So there's a certain kind of person that comes to these events, and they're highly engaged in the issues usually. They are the sort of people who do want a stimulating intellectual conversation at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. It's so hard sometimes to guess who's coming. But my guess was I've got a highly engaged, highly educated professional audience. My assumptions about age may not have been correct, but I think that was pretty much right. And one of my deliberate things was, as we will discuss, I was talking about food technology, and particularly food technologies that are aimed at reducing the environmental impact of agriculture. I assumed that the audience would be totally on board with that premise.
Yes. And I remember on the night you going, oh, phew, because I have not prepared that other section correctly.
I assumed that I would not have to persuade that audience that agriculture should reduce its environmental impact. It would have been a very different thing had I been assuming, like if I was going to give science in the pub in a rural town, I would not have made that assumption about that audience. So that's why audience is important, because it actually determined what I said as well as how I said it. So that's the audience. But it's interesting, I think, that these events don't have a lot of evaluation associated with them. It's very difficult to assess the impact. I was reading this really lovely paper about dialogue events, sort of suggests that people just typically, the audience just assumes it's like a classroom and they take the role of pupil, and whoever has the audience is taking the role of teacher. And that, you know, that sort of dynamic is what people just fit into, and I think that just happens straight away.
Yeah, it's like you're the expert, we're sitting with a pint glass in hand, and we're just going to have this knowledge wash over us.
Yeah.
It's very deficit model, episode 4 if you're interested.
Yes. So of course, you know, within our audience, I had no idea necessarily who was going to turn up. There could have been people who were far more into this particular topic than I was, which actually happened. But the other thing is that there are multiple audiences even there, is that there were potentially investors, potentially collaborators in that audience. And one of the key audiences for my own work in this particular context is the University of Western Australia. And the MC for this event was the Deputy Vice-Chancellor. I've never met her before. And this would have been the first opportunity that she would have ever had to have heard from me about the importance of science communication research.
Wow.
Which was why I did what I did as well.
That makes a lot of sense, because here you are saying these events don't have a lot of evaluation. I don't necessarily believe in them. I could be putting words in your mouth right now, but
Well,
are they effective?
I believe they're important, but I don't assume that this talk will instantly persuade someone to think differently than the way they did when they walked into that event. This event alone may not do that.
Yes.
But it might spark some curiosity and things. It might trigger a few things. And yeah, we'll come to message. We're still an audience.
But this is how it works.
So you can't look at audience, purpose and message. They are interdependent.
Exactly.
They
Their
all
event
influence each other.
diagram with 3 circles in it. You have to talk about each one
Absolutely.
each time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we move on to purpose then?
Yes. So in terms of audience-related goals then, because we were talking about them first, as I said, I didn't expect that I was going to give anyone a threshold learning moment and suddenly their worldview will have changed. That doesn't happen very often.
As I have learnt recently, I shan't name, but yeah, I went in thinking that I could change hearts and minds, and I went, oh, that was a very lofty personal goal, but I may have had some thoughts that were not shared in the public. So,
and in some ways it's really almost arrogant to imagine that someone's going to listen to you for half an hour and their worldview is incredibly different. I mean, I'm not Jane Goodall. Come on. I'm just me, right? So
Yeah.
I know I'm not going to do that. So in terms of my purpose and in terms of the audience, I definitely wanted to raise awareness that science communication is a thing.
yes.
And that science communication is important for a range of reasons, and in particular the area that I've spent most of my work in terms of agricultural technologies and food, something that's so fundamental to us, so everyday, our food, that science communication has a role in that, and the kinds of decisions that we make. And that there's also some things we still don't understand about some of these incredibly everyday individual decisions. So it was really just trying to raise awareness that science communication is a thing, and that talking about food technologies is tricky because, you know, there's a whole heap of responses to something like food, which is at one point scientific, but also incredibly social and cultural. So that's why it's fun.
My experiences as a speech pathologist mean that 80% of your adult caseload is all around swallowing. And that's when you learn food is social, food is so much more than just nutrition, because a lot of the clientele, they can't swallow for whatever reason and have to have a feeding tube, and they get socially disconnected.
Absolutely.
And all of those sorts of things. So I definitely resonated with your talk. And as well, I grew up on a wheat and sheep farm. So this is where all these audiences intersect and overlap.
Yeah, absolutely. So that were my audience-related goals. It was really just about raising awareness of science communication and also doing what it says on the tin, hoping that I give them an hour of time that they thought was well spent.
Yes.
You know, that it was an interesting conversation. It was like, yeah, that was an evening where, you know, I'm not thinking, wow, that's an hour of my life I'm not going to get back, right? So that's pretty much my goal. But it meant that for this talk, I also had a range of personal goals. I've not done a public event in Perth for a long time. I've only done one, I think, in the whole time I've been here, and I used to do these a lot more. And so for me, it's about transitioning from a researcher identity into more of a teaching one. I was feeling like I was losing my research. I want to be both a research-led and practice-led teacher. So I don't want to just say to you students, research says you should do this. I'm also saying that my 25 years of being a science communicator also says you should do this. And so I need to keep my hand in as a practitioner teacher as well and test myself. And I like that testing myself and seeing, can I do this? Can I actually talk about food technologies but also be talking about science communication at the same time?
And having those two goals interweaved. Again, we can talk about this later on, but assessing how well you did. I thought you did well, but I also, for a time there, was spending 8 hours in your presence every week. So I kind of also get an idea of your inner
you started to see the method in my madness, which is what we're sort of talking about here. But yeah, so it's partly to do with my changing identity as a more teaching-based academic, very much grounded in science communication now, whereas before it was more around food values and the role that science communication played in that. So I wanted to sort of do something that reflected that change in identity and to sort of show that I can still talk about my research in a way that's very much grounded in my identity as chair of the discipline of science communication at UWA and advocating for my discipline through the research that I've done.
Fantastic. And did you have any audience goals as part of your purpose?
Well, like I said, that idea of just saying that science communication is actually a thing, people work in it, it's all of that stuff, and that they didn't regret coming.
It's a little side tangent, we can cut this out if need be, but I recently interviewed Alana Dooley, who currently works at SciTech, and she was saying, I want to live in a world where I say I'm a science communicator or I do science communication and people don't give you that blank look. And that is an experience since coming on board to the science communication course is I'm even having to purpose audience message what science communication is, depending on who I think I'm talking to.
Absolutely. This is, when I meet someone at the pub, what's science communication? Well, I might say that, it's about teaching scientists to talk about their work to people who aren't scientists. But it's way bigger than that. To me, science communication, as I said in the talk, I'm interested in how people talk about science because it tells me what they think and feel about science, but it also tells me about this broader relationship between science and society. And that's the thing that really fascinates me, is how we have these negotiations about what kind of science we want done, what technology we need. Is this technology going to benefit society? Is this going to be bad for society? How do we actually do that? That's the thing that I'm fascinated with.
And would you say that's your key messages, or are there any other part of that?
I definitely think this was a key message within this talk, which is why I mentioned it explicitly, but I think it's part of what I mean about my changing identity. When I was a researcher, my key messages were related to adopting those key messages or people understanding those messages so that they could use them. Now it's very much more about science communication is not just about, telling the community how we spent their tax dollars on science.
Science communication. Science isn't done until it's communicated, that old phrase.
It's more about communication as a fundamental aspect of science and this co-creation of science and society together and the role of communication in that. And that is a key message that I take to scientists regularly, that science communication is not just about how they might talk to the media, but it's about this broader relationship. And it's when I'm talking to the community, when I talk about science communication, I frame it very much in making sure that they get the information they need to make decisions. And that's what's shifted for me as a science communication practitioner when I started, where I was communicating to the community on behalf of scientists. Now I find I'm communicating to scientists on behalf of the community. That's what I do. And that means that we are always boundary spanners. We're always on the boundary. And that's what I think is fascinating about being a science communicator.
I very much agree on that sentiment. I enjoy that I get to do both science and social sciences, for want of a better expression. I get to do everything, essentially.
It's like everything's connected.
Yes, everything is connected. Last but not least, message.
Yes, the last part of PAM, purpose, audience, message. So it's probably going to seem really strange to say that when I was thinking about this, my message didn't actually include anything about food. That was not my message. I did have to think really critically about that because I also did not want my audience to feel that they'd been tricked.
Yes.
So I had to give the audience what they came for. And this particular talk was advertised as me talking about food, how do people decide? But I really wanted that. SciComm is a thing and it's important. I very much tried to leave out the sciencey bit and focus when I start talking about the 3 technologies. And I'm hoping that, most of the people who are listening to this have already listened to the podcast or read the sort of my original version of the talk. But when I talk about the 3 food technologies, I was trying not to explain too much about the science. I know that I went too much on the science on the technology, which is gene editing, because I geek out on it. That's just me. But the research suggests, and some of my own research suggests, people are less interested in the technical details of the science and far more interested in the what does it mean for me. So I've tried to focus on that. The other thing with each of the technologies that I tried to focus on was not so much, again, these are the issues, but that this is what other people think,
yes,
and that these are the issues that other people have raised. And I was thinking about that in connection to the theory of planned behaviour, which says that, behaviour change does rely on 3 things. One is attitudes, the other is social norms, what does everyone else think? And that third is perceived behavioural control, and that's the one that's most strongly linked. But I was trying to work not so much on the attitudes and trying to change individual attitudes, but show that through that social norming aspect. What do other people think about this? So I was actually trying to link that through and say, well, 50% of people would try an insect, would you? Kind of thing.
Yeah, and of course this doesn't translate into a podcast, but if you were there on the night, you asked us to put our hands up and then do a survey, a visual survey, and then feeding that back into the podcast. Is this the difference between presenting and making a podcast?
Oh, I do think so. Well, I mean, that's having a live audience. You get that response. But that's really where, into the design of the talk and coming back to this particular format, I kind of struggled, because research around dialogue events, and like I said, I was sort of thinking about this as a potential dialogue event. Most of them, the agenda's pretty set. You've got a speaker that speaks for 30 minutes and then you get the opportunity to questions. And that's not a dialogue. That's not a discussion. And so I was wanting almost to find out what the audience thought about these technologies and try to leave as much room for the questions. But it meant that I was almost breaking my own rules, if you like, by even participating in an event like this, which is already kind of too prescribed for the kind of third order, open communication, flatter kind of structure where I'm not out the front as the expert and everyone is different. I mean, everyone's an expert about their own opinion. So it was tricky that way, that I wasn't able to have more audience participation through the first section that I would have liked.
Yeah, so more about the design and the presenting of the talk that you did at the event. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so one of the things we talk about in the science presentation unit is structure. Once we've got the purpose, audience, message, we say then, all of those other things are the design choices that follow from that. I did try to do the classic rule of 3, your introduction, 3 points, conclusion. But what I wanted to do was actually a 3+1 to kind of subvert that, do a 3-4. But I think in the end on the night, because I was starting to run over time, I might have blended it. But I did actually write it very quickly. I went half an hour. I've got, 5-6 minute chunks, which is the 3+1, or 6 5-minute chunks if I wanted to do the 3+1 plus introduction and conclusion. But I did want to try the 3. So I had to pick 3 technologies that I would talk about. But I knew that I had to set that up, so that I had to cover off what is science communication, why am I a science communicator, how does this relate to food. I had to credential myself as somebody who has at least worked in food and who's done research on this. And then I had to sort of set up the premise, which is that agriculture needs to reduce its emissions. And you can see why I did not want to spend any time on that, because that would have been half an hour. So I just took a punt that everyone was in agreement with that, so that then I could talk about the 3 technologies, introduce them very briefly into what they are, but look at what the research that's there. I have done research on 2 of the technologies that I spoke about, and the other I read a lot, I guess. Yes. And then, that conclusion. I had practiced several bits of it, but I had not actually written the whole presentation till the afternoon. So This is a confession, and I say this because we all do it. But this is why when I'm teaching you all, I say practice, 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 practice. Please do what I do. Don't do what I say. Do what I say. Sorry, don't do what I do. So I knew that I wanted that structure. I knew that I wanted to talk about the food technologies and come to the end and say, well, while I've been talking about food, I've been talking about science communication, and really make those key points around no research agenda, limited research capacity. Those were the big points that I wanted to make, where I'm advocating for my discipline, and I really wanted to say them in front of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research.
Yes.
So that's where I needed to get to. So in terms of that structure, I wanted to have that arc of an introduction. I wanted to be able to talk about the 3 technologies and have audience responses at the end of each of those, so that there's little gaps, so that it's very chunky, because the other part of these presentations is there's no visual aids, there's no slides, no PowerPoint presentation. So to speak for half an hour or so without any visual aids, without notes, like we could use notes, but I wear reading glasses. So I can't see the audience and read notes at the same time. I had to make a choice.
Is that why? See, I remember in science presentations you saying, yeah, you can get up with notes. I prefer if you didn't, because it's distracting.
Because you're holding something in your hand. I had a handheld microphone and these post-it note, like these notes, and I can't talk without them in my hand. So I was trying to juggle them. But that's why I had palm cards, because I didn't rehearse enough, because there was a few statistics that I didn't want to get wrong, and I wanted to be able to check, but I needed to be able to actually see them. And I'm the sort of person, without my glasses, my focal length is longer than my arm. So I needed to be able to hold them in my hand and look. I mean, other people I noticed in the photos from the event, because there was 10 speakers all up that night. Some of them have got printed out notes. There was a suggestion to use the phone. There was no way I would have been able to see it. I needed to have it in big print, and that's why I had those palm cards. But that's why recognizing that I didn't practice enough was, I knew that going into it. I just made that job just so much harder by not practicing, and I'm annoyed because I went over time, which is a cardinal sin in presentations, but it's just more that I just knew that there were places that were clunky. I know we're going to get back to what it's like to listen back, but I have found several errors on listening back that I know were just because of my nervousness. I mean, I think there's this sort of idea that science communicators are natural extroverts and that we love being the centre of attention and that we love being on a stage.
Gosh, no.
This is so not true. And so the mental work that you have to do, as I say when I'm teaching presentations, I do say some affirmations, and they're not particularly lofty. I tell myself, you are generally okay at this. You will probably be okay again. You know, I'm not out there going, yeah, I'm going to nail it. I'm going to be awesome, because it's just not that. But it meant that I had to really talk to myself hard and really believe that I was going to be okay, even though I knew I hadn't practiced. I knew this was important. I knew I was going to have you in the audience. I knew I was going to have the Deputy Vice-Chancellor in the audience. I did not know that I was going to have Oren from Symbiotica in the audience until I actually started talking about Symbiotica.
And Oren was responsible for developing which technology again?
Well, the lab-grown meat. They developed it as an art installation to provoke conversation about the use of food technology and the future of food. So I'm glad I mentioned them. But yeah, to actually have someone in the audience who you're speaking about is also quite intimidating. I had my son there. He doesn't usually come to my things. So there was a lot of reasons why I wanted to do well and why I was just so annoyed with myself for not practicing more. So you can avoid all of that stress by just preparing more.
Again, do as you say.
Not as I do. That's why I try to have you guys have a draft a week before so that you're not going through that additional mental load before presenting, because you don't need it if you practice.
On that, what were your immediate reflections once you'd done the talk?
First of all, I went over time, should have practiced more. All of that, just like everyone else, I did kind of think there was the other usual reflection I have is I think I got away with it, which is like, hopefully people haven't gone away and gone, she's a professional science communicator. Ooh. So I think I achieved that. It is lovely performing in front of a live audience, and you do get that initial response, and I think everyone seemed engaged and they seemed to enjoy it. But I did find myself absolutely churning about the very first question I got as soon as I finished speaking. And so for context, there was a gentleman in the audience who was a food technologist who, after I finished speaking, wanted to update the audience on the lab-grown meat part of my talk. I had kind of, and this is another really interesting choice when you're a science communicator, should we have an opinion?
Yeah.
And what is the difference between an opinion and an evidence-based position? Because in my head, they're the same thing. I don't form an opinion without some kind of evidence base. Of course, that evidence might be lived experience, but I know that I don't just make stuff up. So I have come to an evidence-based position on lab-grown meat that I think it is unlikely to replace farmed meat in the mainstream. And I was basing that on some research that I have definitely mentioned in the blog post that was really looking at this, in particular, the particular comment that Paul Wood, who's a very well-respected scientist in Australia, makes in this particular paper, is that it's unlikely to reduce food inequality because of the technological innovation you need. So even leaving aside the animal welfare comments, and I was pretty sure that some of the substrates had been updated so that they could produce it with very little animal substances. But I was really sort of churning through that because the gentleman spoke for about 5 minutes.
Of which the entire time I was like, and your question is, and your question is.
It was one of those moments where I was kind of waiting for a question and it never came.
Yeah. It was like, okay, this is just a bunch of statements put together, and if you're the expert, then why don't you come up and give Heather's talk then?
But I think, on reflection, I was thinking, well, in some ways he proved my point, because the point I had made about lab-based meat or cultured meat or cell-based meats is that there are a range of competing claims in this domain. And in some ways he beautifully illustrated my point, because the point he was making was that Singapore is investing very heavily in lab-based meat, that they're really looking to food innovation, and that there's already some cultured meat products for sale there, and that Australia's food regulator has recently approved one of their food products. Which again, I'm fine with, but I was originally thinking about, that just proves my point about them being conflicting claims. But then I started to think, well, hang on a sec, no, they're actually contextual claims, because the idea that a country like Singapore might be looking at food innovations like lab-grown meat when they're very small land mass. You can't have a wheat and sheep station like where you're from in Singapore, right? You just can't. And I think this shows that there are contexts where these technologies may become accepted, where in other contexts they're not. I mean, one of the points I didn't make through this talk, which I was again, I had to make some choices for time, but I can imagine some of my colleagues in my voice going, well, what about the role of agroecology, which is about as far from lab-based meat as you can get, something that is really about working with the land, that is not about monocultures, that is small peasant-based agriculture, as it's sometimes called, the sorts of things that the Australian food sovereignty movement advocate. I definitely think that there's a role for that as well, and I think there's a role for all of these technologies, but I still think that both of us can be right. I think this gentleman can be right, and that lab-grown meat, the cultured quail burger that you could buy in Singapore might be very delicious, but that I still think that we're still going to see animal agriculture in some contexts, I think. And again, that's because food is cultural, not just scientific.
Exactly. So listening back to the podcast, what were your initial thoughts, feelings?
Yeah, it's funny. Listening to it was a different experience to reflecting on it initially, where, like most people, I was thinking about all the mistakes I made. And then I thought, I think overall it was fine. But then the listening to it, and the paper we were talking about right at the very beginning suggested that usually people have they feel better after they see it or watch it. I felt way worse, because I could identify at least 3 places where I say absolutely the wrong word. So I thought, no, there's parts of it that sounded better. Like you couldn't hear the nervousness in my voice as much as I expect, but that me tripping over my tongue and saying the wrong word, that's me being nervous, and I can hear it. And I think it's the difference between watching yourself and then listening. And because the podcast is very much in your ears, and I was really listening to the words, I thought, no, that's the wrong word, that's the wrong word. And I think I probably could have handled that particular question better. I think in the end I did deal with it okay, of saying, this just goes to show that there are a range of attitudes and opinions about things like lab-grown meat. But there was a couple of bits that I left out, which you do. But on the whole, it was just like, I made a couple of mistakes. But I tend to be one of these people that's very hard on myself as well. And so saying, once again, this is an opportunity to learn. I know that what I need to do to improve next time is practice more. And, that part of this reflection too, and going, okay, yeah, well, I might not have done that bit so well, but I still think the approach, seemed to work. People responded to it. It was really interesting that all the questions were about food technology and not SciComm. So that means that I didn't go too hard on the SciComm stuff, that there was enough of the food tech there that people felt that the conversation was about food technology.
At the same time, though, you gave the audience what they wanted and what they signed up for.
Well, that's what I meant. I took that as a sign that I did that. The fact that all of the questions were about the technologies and not science communication.
Gotcha.
So that I did give them enough meat in that sandwich.
To excuse the pun.
Yeah.
Another part of listening back to the podcast is the fact that there were other people that night that I could have chosen to go, and yet I went to my lecturers instead. Do you want to talk more about that?
So one of the things I encourage people to listen to their own stuff, but I thought, well, I should have a listen to some of my colleagues. And one of my colleagues here, Professor Paul McGinn, we've known each other for a while, usually end up at meetings and sort of talk about academic life, hashtag with a Y. But I'd never heard him speak about his research before. And he's from Northern Ireland, and so he's just got that accent, which is just amazing to listen to, whereas I'm so nasal and speak like there's no way a fly is going to get in my mouth, which is why I speak that way. But
I object because you tell us to revel in our authenticity.
I know. But he just was he did the rule of three and was open about it, and did it the rule of 3 plus 1 with so he did the half pike with a double twist. But he just wove these 3 meandering streams of thought into this beautiful braided kind of story where you end up at the end, and there was this sort of complicated terminology, but he made it so relevant, and the 3 strands just came together, and he tied it in this most beautiful, exquisite bow at the end. And I'd seen him a few days before the talk, and we're like, oh yeah, have you written it? Nah, just gonna make some stuff up or something. He said, I was just thought, oh, if only I could do that. But again, I was already putting a lot of pressure on myself, and I think, maybe if I wasn't so much in my head, I might have been able to relax. And that to me is when you can become a storyteller like that, and it just flows like water. And when you can do that and be in the moment, and you can hear him responding to the audience and changing tacks, but he always comes back to the main idea and keeps it, just on point. So I haven't listened to the rest of my colleagues. If there's anyone out there who would like me to listen to theirs, I will get round to them. But that one of Paul's was just, and because it's not science, I really wanted to listen to one of the not sciencey ones, because his thing is urban planning.
Oh, gotcha.
And I thought, how is someone going to make urban planning a beautiful story? And he just, on point. It was fabulously done.
There you go. As we wrap things up, what are your parting comments and conclusions from this experience?
Don't compare yourself to others. And I do think that, I think that's absolutely a genuine thing. And it's still something that I'm learning. I'm 54 years old, and I should have learned that lesson by now. I should have learnt the lesson about practicing as well before now. So I do think it's really important to make sure that you run your own race and that you're thinking about where you are. I know that that's been a long time since I've done one of those, and I was pretty happy with how I did overall. I think it's provided me with an opportunity to practice and be a practitioner, be in that moment, thinking about those, I'm reconciling the theory and the literature and the research with practice. Can I have a research-led practice as well as research and practice-led teaching? I think it was important that you and your classmates saw me doing the thing that I teach.
Yes.
That is really important.
That was fascinating for me anyway, because there's Heather the lecturer, and here I am seeing Heather the science communicator talking to someone who is not her students, because people actually laughed at your jokes.
Yes, finally. This is what I mean about the audience being older. Yeah, there's people who got my references. So yes, there was that. Having people laugh at my jokes was quite lovely. So there was all of those good things about it. I think that challenge that I set myself of crafting a talk that talks about science communication and the importance that it has in some of our everyday decision making, I feel like I did that. And I think the key thing is that definitely I would encourage practicing. Please do what I say, not what I do. Be kind to yourself when you listen back. I still struggle with that. It is still so important. I listened to my own, found mistakes, listened to Paul's and thought, wow, what am I even doing?
He may have the same reflections upon his own performance.
Exactly. And I think, again, it was like, well, this is, I'm running my own race. And I think, the task that I set myself is a challenging one. There are things that I could do to improve, but I think overall I did what I set out to do. And, there was people who came up to me, the teacher that asked a question,
Yes.
she said straight away, will you talk to my food technology students? Would you come to my school? Love to. Oren from Symbiotica said, oh, we've got to talk,
Yes.
And I'm like, yes. Actually, I should say Oren from the Institute of Advanced Studies. He's changed his affiliation. So, there are opportunities, potential for collaboration. And it also gave me a chance to think critically about what on face value might be contested or competing claims, but are actually contextual claims. And that we don't have to see, if we're really talking about this idea of embracing multiple ways of knowing, that I should be getting out of the binary of right and wrong and going, yes, all these things can be true. How can they all be true simultaneously?
Exactly.
And sort of working with that.
And ultimately, the bottom line is that the audience recollections are probably very different from your own.
Thanks for listening. Find us online at thescicommcollective.com. That's com with 2 M's. Questions or comments about today's episode? Get in touch on Instagram at the SciComm Collective. The SciComm Collective is supported by UWA's Grand Challenges Impact Grant.